Pierre Trudeau is equally loved and hated in Canada. During his 15 years in office, he managed to simultaneously piss off Quebec and Alberta. He made headlines in Canada and all over the world for his eccentric personality, his bachelor lifestyle, and his unconventional approach to politics and life. He's also a man of deep intellect who combined all of his knowledge on politics, of Canadian history, of constitutional law, his travel experiences, all of them together while he was Prime Minister. He's a man who thought deeply about Canadian identity and fought for unity at a time of great upheaval for our country. This is the man who believed in Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Canada must be unified. Canada must be one. Canada must be progressive. And Canada must be a just society.
Pierre Elliott Trudeau was born on October 18th, 1919 in Montreal. He was raised in a fully bilingual and affluent family where his father, Charles-Émile, was a francophone in Montreal who owned a couple of successful businesses, and his mother, Grace Elliott, was an Anglo-Canadian. His father's businesses allowed the family to live a life of privilege compared to many in Montreal and in Canada at the time. That financial security gave him access to some of the most prestigious educational institutions in Canada. Trudeau's formal education began at the Collège Jean Rebirth in Montreal. During his time there, he was known as a free thinker, someone who was proning individual rights, someone who embraced his dual identity as a francophone and an anglophone. When Pierre was 15 years old, his father passed away and left him a significant inheritance.
And I stopped on the landing. My aunt said to me, "Your father is dead." I remember sitting down and feeling this is the end of the world.
So when he finished his studies at Rebirth, he used that financial freedom to bring him endless educational and travel opportunities. He would then go on to study law at the University of Montreal. He embarked on a canoe journey from Montreal all the way to the James Bay, trying to replicate the insane lifestyle of the voyageurs back in the day. This trip gave him a whole new perspective of Canada and what it was to be Canadian, away from the cosmopolitan city, one where he would appreciate the vastness, the natural beauty of our country, and the numerous cultures that inhabit it too. Afterwards, he would then go on to Harvard, where he studied political science. He went to Paris. He went to the London School of Economics. By the time he's done all of this, he's 28 years old, and unlike many of his friends who are settling down, having kids, he decides that he wants to travel the world and sets off on a backpacking expedition. His travels took him all over Europe, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, Japan. This time of his life would take him to so many different parts of the world where he would experience different cultures and live a whole bunch of crazy experiences, like getting captured by some Palestinian warriors who thought he was a Jewish spy, going to communist countries like the USSR and China.
These guys invited me into one of the coffee shops and passed the hookah around, and I smoked it. What was in it, I don't know. But it was probably some hash. I remember sitting down with Indian workers who were tired and who pass, you know how they smoke, they suck through their hand with the joint stuck in the knuckles so you can pass it hygienically around. And I'd smoke it and don't know what it was. Same thing in China. Smoked all kinds of things.
He would absorb all of this knowledge about different cultures, different political ideologies that he would later on apply during his political career. Pierre would be 30 years old by the time he came back to Quebec and would quickly get involved into the modern day issues of his province and the country as a whole. As a precursor to the Quiet Revolution, he took part in the asbestos strike against Maurice Duplessis. Maurice Duplessis' reign from 1944 to 1959 is known as La Grande Noirceur in Quebec, the Great Darkness, and it's a time where there was a lot of repression of censorship was in Quebec. You have to understand too that at the time, most Quebec companies were owned by either Anglophone or Americans who, with the support of the church and the government, were promised a docile labor force. The asbestos strike changed this, and it was a sign of the incoming Quiet Revolution in Quebec.
This is a fight for recognition. This isn't a fight for certain advantages. And I think trade union people throughout the province should rise in arms and not in arms, should lay down their tools and show their economic force.
Pierre also became involved in the intellectual and political discussions surrounding Quebec nationalism. He would contribute articles to the influential journal called Cité Libre, where he, along with many other intellectuals, discussed ideas related to federalism, French-Canadian identity, and the evolving nature of Quebec within the Canadian Confederation. He even held debates with René Lévesque at the time before both of them began their respective political careers. He even worked very briefly at the Privy Council in federal politics, where he himself saw directly the lack of the use of French in federal politics. By the time 1959 comes around, Pierre, he's 40 years old and he has all of this travel experience. He's very educated. He's known as a polemicist. He'll write a couple of articles sometimes. He's engaged in political debates about Quebec, Francophone identity, Canadian identity, but doesn't necessarily have a fixed past in life. So when we head into the 1960s, that's when you'll see the rise of Pierre Elliott Trudeau within Canadian politics. The 60s started off with him being a professor of constitutional law at the University of Montreal, and it coincided with the period of rising separatism in Quebec. For Pierre, he was for the separation of the church and the state, the end of censorship, the end of repression in Quebec. But he also distinguished himself within the Quebec political landscape by being a staunch federalist and being against Quebec separatism. In 1965, this would ultimately culminate to the trio of Pierre Trudeau, Gérald Pelletier, and Jean Marchand entering federal politics with the aim of influencing and advancing their vision for Canada during a particularly significant period of social and political change. They were known as the Three Wise Men and decided to join the Liberal Party of Canada, the party which they thought would be most likely to implement their vision of what was to be Canada, and the party most likely to win a federal election.
I thought that it was perhaps time for me to try and stop criticizing others and start trying to do something. And if I succeed, well and good, and if I don't, I hope others will criticize me, and I hope I will get the heck out of there.
In the same year, Lester B. Pearson appointed Trudeau as the Minister of Justice, and it marked a significant step in his political career where he would implement far-reaching reforms like the decriminalization of homosexuality, the liberalization of divorce laws in Canada.
There's no place for the state in the bedrooms of the nation.
One of the more enlightened clauses, I think, in your bill is the fact that
One of the more enlightened clauses. How nice. I know this is a very reactionary law, but, we're only a liberal government. We're not an anarchist one.
Trudeau's charismatic and unconventional approach to politics gave him a lot of media attention and led to the emergence of what we call Trudeau-mania. This is at a time too when mass media was emerging. Politics and entertainment are now being mixed together, and he's at the forefront of all of that. He was portrayed as a rich bachelor, a playboy who had the fanciest cars, who had class, style, who dated the most beautiful women. His leadership style was unconventional. He would do acrobatics, wink at the camera, he had a nonchalant attitude.
What's your ultimate goal in life? Do you want to be Prime Minister someday?
Hell no. I won't even be Minister of Justice if you don't let me go back to work.
How badly do you want to be Prime Minister?
Not very badly. Men who want very badly to lead the country shouldn't be trusted.
Despite his initial reluctance to enter federal politics, Trudeau's popularity and appeal propelled him to become the leader of the Liberal Party, and he would enter the 1968 federal election as the clear-cut favorite. He was arguably the best person at that time who could lead Canada during a time of crisis, someone who embodied that dual identity of Anglophone and Francophone, and committed to a united Canada. It wasn't all roses for him though, and with all that media attention also came some very nasty remarks about him. Media outlets would dig into his past, claiming he was a secret communist because he had visited the USSR and China. Some even wrote that he was gay, probably in response to his homosexuality bill. His commitment to federalism, to Canadian unity, also made him one of the most hated figures in his own province of Quebec, where he was being accused of betraying his own kind.
What do you mean by two nations? What do you mean by special status to Quebec?
Sur le diagnostic, remarque bien, je suis d'accord probablement avec les indépendantistes. Je trouve qu'il y a un certain nombre de choses qui vont mal, comme eux. Je trouve que la faute est largement aux Anglo-Canadiens, comme eux. C'est sur les remèdes qu'on n'est pas d'accord. Mais j'ai jamais pensé qu'un homme politique, dans un État libre, dans un État démocratique, devait essentiellement se définir en fonction d'une race ou d'une ethnie. Je trouve que c'est justement l'erreur de ceux qui m'accusent, par exemple, de ne pas parler au nom des Canadiens français. Ils supposent qu'un politicien n'est pas le représentant du peuple, mais le représentant d'une ethnie. Et moi, je trouve ça faux. Ça m'insulte pas qu'on me dise que je suis pas un digne représentant des Canadiens français. Je prétends pas l'être. Je prétends parler au nom de toute la collectivité, qui inclut bien d'autres choses que des Canadiens français.
This all culminated on the night before the election where Trudeau attended the Saint Jean-Baptiste celebration in Montreal, and many Quebec separatists, Quebec nationalists were there and didn't want him there.
Refuse d'accepter l'existence de la nation canadienne-française ou québécoise comme telle.
And all of these Canadian federal politicians were attending the ceremony, and they started throwing rocks, garbage towards all of them, and he decided to stand his ground. He would not leave. He would confront all of these protesters who were treating him like crap in his own native city where he grew up.
Je pense, Henri, que nous devrions terminer ici.
Monsieur Trudeau insiste, il veut demeurer sur place.
So while he had that reputation of being a playboy, having all of this charisma, he showed on that night that he's not someone who's going to back down, be intimidated. He was willing to take crap from his own province, the media. He would continually fight to preserve Canada. On the next day, Pierre Elliott Trudeau won a full-on majority government and start one of the most impactful reigns in our history. His first term from 1968 to 1972 would be defined by four things: bilingualism and multiculturalism, his foreign policy, Quebec separatism, and his international celebrity status. In 1969, he would pass the Official Languages Act, which solidified his commitment to bilingualism in federal institutions and services.
We can't even speak our own language. We go to Ottawa, we met at the door of Parliament, we want to see our member of Parliament. We can't speak to a policeman or to a porter who will understand what we say. We're not at home. Go to the courts and we can't be heard in our own language and so on. So everything that was federal, we said we would make bilingual.
Multiculturalism also became the official policy of the Canadian government in 1971. Multiculturalism for Pierre was the best way of ensuring cultural freedom for all Canadians across the whole country. It made Canada one of the first countries around the world to adopt that kind of policy. This notion even extended to Indigenous people, and that was manifested by his white papers of 1969. The white papers were meant to assimilate all Indigenous people into this broader Canadian society by eliminating all of their legal distinctions. It wanted to dismantle the Indian Act, terminate treaties, Department of Indian Affairs. The white papers were super controversial at the time and actually had a lot of opposition from all Indigenous communities across Canada. Now we're going to jump into his foreign policy, and if I had to sum it up, he wanted to show the world that we weren't just a puppet of the United States. We could fix our own foreign policy objectives. He wanted to reduce our economic dependence on the US, pivot towards Asia, pivot towards Europe. He wanted to reform NATO. He provided technical assistance to Singapore, to Malaysia. At first, he was neutral when it came to the Vietnam War, but later on would condemn the American war in Vietnam when a Canadian peacekeeper died. Canada under Trudeau was also the first Western country to normalize diplomatic relations with China. This happened in 1970, and it was a clear departure from the traditional Cold War approach and reflected our desire to engage country based off of peace, cooperation, and diplomacy. Pierre Trudeau became an international celebrity. Whether it was the fact he was dating beautiful women like Barbara Streisand, meeting John Lennon, Yoko Ono, going to the fanciest restaurants, all these elite gatherings, being on the cover of magazines. He even got married in 1971 while he was Prime Minister to Margaret St. Clair, who would later on have his first son, Justin Trudeau, who's obviously our Prime Minister today. But when they got married, that was a huge publicized event in Canada and all over the world too. With all of this media coverage also came a lot of flack, a lot of dislike from Canadians especially. Here we can see Pierre confronting people who were protesting in Alberta against the Canadian Weed Board.
He doesn't mind being vulgar, but he doesn't want to do it over the microphone. And don't bring signs saying that I hustle women, because I won't talk to you.
The same thing in Quebec too, where despite Pierre's efforts to implement bilingualism to increase francophone representation within the federal government, it's not stopping the rise of Quebec separatism. It's even leading to radical groups who are committed to Quebec independence by using violent means. The FLQ was an anti-capitalist, anti-federalist, anti-English group who would bomb figures of English domination in Montreal like banks, various businesses, the Montreal Stock Exchange. And in October 1970, all of this came to a head and would become one of the most defining moments of Canadian history and Pierre Elliott Trudeau's reign. On October 5th, 1970, the FLQ kidnapped James Cross, who was the British Trade Commissioner to Canada, and 5 days later, on October 10th, they captured Pierre Laporte, who was the Minister of Labour and the Vice Premier of Quebec.
The Front de Libération du Québec wants complete independence for all Quebecers, united in a free society, purged forever of its clique of voracious sharks, the patronizing big bosses and their henchmen who have made Quebec their private preserve for cheap labor and unscrupulous exploitation.
So you know what Pierre Trudeau did to respond to that? He sent in the frickin' army to re-establish order in the streets of Montreal and even made fun of people who were questioning him on it.
With all these men with guns around here.
Haven't you noticed?
Yeah, I've noticed them. Why you people decided to have them?
What's your worry?
I'm not worried, but you
So
seem
if you're
to
not
be.
worried, what's your... I don't worry.
I'm worried about living in a town that's full of people with guns running around in it.
Are you? Have they done anything to you? Have they pushed you around or anything?
On October 16, 1970, he announced the implementation of the War Measures Act, a law that granted the government unprecedented powers during times of war, invasion, or insurrections. If you were a citizen in Quebec, and especially in Montreal, you had no civil rights. Despite the implementation of the War Measures Act, negotiations between the government and the FLQ failed, and on October 17th, Pierre Laporte's body was discovered in the trunk of a car.
And I can't help feeling, as a Canadian, a deep sense of shame that this cruel and senseless act should have been conceived in cold blood and executed in like manner. And I want to express to Mrs. Laporte and to Mr. Laporte's family the very deep regrets of the Canadian people, of the Canadian government, and our desire as Canadians to stick together in this very sorry moment of our history.
It was almost 2 months later that James Cross would finally be released. The FLQ crisis, the October crisis, the War Measures Act, all of this had a profound impact on us, on Canadian society, on Canadian politics, because it raised questions about what kind of measures the government should be implementing in times like these. There's a lot of parallels that can be made with what happened not too long ago here too. At the end of the term in 1972, it seems that he's done a lot of talking but not a lot of doing, because unemployment in Canada is going up and the economic situation is not looking too good in Canada, and that would show in the next election of 1972. He would pay for a lot of this, a lot of his actions, and his honeymoon phase was definitely over. The election of 1972 would see Pierre and the Liberal Party win a very thin minority, and he largely supported himself for the next 2 years with the help of the NDP. He also had to adjust his behavior a bit, his political tactics, tone down the rhetoric on bilingualism, Canadian identity, and all of that stuff, and attempt to make himself look more likable in the media, for Canadians at least. Apart from that, his most significant event probably during that time was the fact that he visited actually China in 1973, but from 1972 to 1974, this time was spent to rebuild his image and then gain a majority government for the next election, which he would do. Now, despite winning this majority back, his third term from 74 to 79 would be marked by many disappointments and even lead to the brief end of his political career. It's during that time that you also saw Trudeau and his wife Margaret have that famous visit in Cuba. Trudeau's visit marked the establishment of the first full diplomatic relations between Canada and Cuba, and it made Canada the first NATO member and first ever Western country to have diplomatic ties with Cuba after the Cuban Revolution. And while this reinforced again the notion that we were a country who were willing to work with anyone and trying to build bridges at the international level, domestically Pierre was facing a lot of troubles. René Lévesque's Parti Québécois won in 1976, which only showed that Quebec separatism just kept on rising.
I've known René Lévesque for many years, some 20 years. I personally know many of his colleagues. I respect their intelligence and their dedication. We all believe in equality. We all want liberty and equality and democracy, but we disagree profoundly on the means to be employed. My disagreement with Mr. Lévesque, dating back some 10 years, arises out of my conviction that there is room in Canada for all Canadians. He, on the other hand, believes the opposite. He has therefore surrounded himself with a strong core of blood brothers, and he speaks to the rest of Canada as one speaks to good neighbors. I believe that it's possible to be at the same time a good Canadian and a good Quebecer, just as it's possible to be a good Canadian and a good Nova Scotian, or a good British Columbian.
It's also the time where you saw the true beginnings of Western alienation was in Canada, and especially in Alberta and the oil industry. The 1970s were a time where many economic crises were happening. You had the oil embargoes of 1973, of 1979.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon. They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories. The Arab countries keep that pledge, it would reduce their production by almost 50% in 1 year.
In response to that, Trudeau started talking about a national energy policy which would tax the export of Albertan oil abroad and subsidize it at lower cost for the rest of the provinces. And from that moment on, you started to see some staunch resistance coming in from Alberta. Even in his personal life, things weren't going too great. In 1977, he got divorced from his wife, Margaret. So 1974 to 1979 was not a good time overall for Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Separatism in Quebec was higher than ever. He had alienated a lot of Western Canadians, in Alberta in particular. He had ran huge deficits. The economy wasn't doing well, and he lost the 1979 election.
I think it is my duty at this time to recommend to my colleagues that we hand the government over, and that I recommend to the Governor General that he ask Mr. Clark to form a government. Mr. Clark.
And we have achieved together a victory for change in this country, and that is what we are together going to achieve.
So for a very brief period of time, Pierre continued on as the Liberal leader, as the leader of the opposition in Parliament, but he was set to resign and go out and live his life, go and travel, go write memoirs and do all of that stuff, all the things that former prime ministers do. But somehow, some way, the Conservative Party weren't able to pass their budget, and Pierre Trudeau was convinced to stay on by his party, and he was seen as the only one who could truly make the Liberal Party gain a majority government once again.
Government has fallen, and it appears there will be another election in Canada soon. The Conservatives were defeated tonight in a motion of non-confidence on the budget.
Trudeau said today he's going to stay on in politics and that he'll try again to become Canada's Prime Minister.
I have accepted the strong appeal of the National Liberal Caucus and the National Liberal Executive, and I will lead our party in the current election campaign. I very much want Western Canadians not only to feel, but to be fully involved in the continuing nation building of Canada. I want to form a government with good people and good representation from Western Canada.
It's kind of crazy because the election in 1980, the Liberal Party won a full-on majority government without winning any seats west of Manitoba, and that just exemplifies perfectly that divide that was happening within the country at the time. It also illustrates perfectly how much of a controversial politician Pierre Trudeau was and how disliked he was by many. However, that election gave Pierre the possibility to really catch up on all the promises that he wasn't able to fulfill, all the things that he wanted to accomplish for his country, and he went into 1980 with only 3 goals in mind for his last tenure as Prime Minister: the Constitution, energy, and Canada's foreign policy. One of his primary goals was to patriate the Canadian Constitution, which would bring it home from the UK to Canada. All of this would culminate with the Constitution Act of 1982 and the establishment of our Charter and Rights and Freedoms.
Have a charter which defines the kind of country in which we wish to live and guarantees the basic rights and freedoms which each of us shall enjoy as a citizen of Canada. It reinforces the protection offered to French-speaking Canadians outside Quebec and to English-speaking Canadians in Quebec. It recognizes our multicultural character. It upholds the equality of women and the rights of disabled persons. It offers a way to meet the legitimate demands of our native people.
However, it's important to note that the Constitution wasn't signed by Quebec. It was only signed by the federal government with an agreement with all of the other English Canadian provinces, but Quebec stayed back, they didn't sign it, and that only drove separatist sentiments even further.
Je dois dire que je regrette profondément que le Québec se retrouve aujourd'hui dans une position qui est devenue en quelque sorte une des traditions fondamentales du régime fédéral canadien tel qu'il fonctionne. Le Québec se retrouve tout seul.
This term was also finally the time for Pierre to implement his National Energy Program. The National Energy Program, or the NEP as it's known today, was designed to increase Canadian control over the energy sector and for him achieve energy self-sufficiency in Canada, but it included pretty drastic measures that would decimate the industry at the time and caused a lot of unemployment in Alberta. Trudeau's governing style, which was very centralization focused, federalist focused, was in huge contrast to the culture of Alberta. The NEP resulted in a lot of economic hardships for many Albertans. And finally now, as his last mark on Canadian foreign policy, Pierre decided to head off on a peace mission, visiting capitals, promoting peace, promoting de-armament, denuclearization at a time where tensions between the USA and the USSR were back rising up. By the end of his term, 1983-1984, it's pretty clear that he's kind of fed up with the prime minister life, and in 1983 he actually boycotted the media.
People don't believe anymore what they read in the newspapers or see on the television. It's been fooled so often that they don't believe it all that much.
So in 1984, his tenure as prime minister finally ended, 15 years of being a prime minister, and he undoubtedly left a lasting legacy in our country. No matter what people think of him, whether they love him or they don't like him, I think people kind of respect him. He was clearly passionate about Canada, he had deep knowledge about our history, and he was a proud Canadian, I feel. And ultimately, I think he represented us with a lot of class abroad. For that, you have to respect the legacy that he left us. He's a controversial man, but he's a respected man. That's what I think.
French-English, regional development, welfare, the problem of the Indians, the problem of multiculturalism, the foreign policy, the defense policy. We have made the decisions, we've laid the groundworks, we've asserted our presence and our intention to establish Canadian identity in a very strong way.
These people in Quebec and in Canada want to split it up. They want to take it away from their children. They want to break it down. No, that's our answer. It's true that our will to live together has sometimes appeared to be in deep hibernation. But it is there, nevertheless, alive and tenacious, in the hearts of Canadians of every province and territory. I